An international energy analyst says that installed energy capacity in South Africa over the last 5 years has outpaced consumption and raises key questions about why the country finds itself in an energy crisis at all. That was one of the key takeaways in a discussion with an international energy policy advisor on the current power crisis gripping the country. Ignacio Fernandez is a senior advisor at the primary electricity supply company in South California, and that's the most populous state in the United States, and by itself the world's 5th largest economy. The state last year experienced rolling blackouts, whilst Fernandez also worked in Chile's Ministry of Energy during the country's energy crisis in 2008. In conversation with the SABC's Sherwin Bryce-Pease, he makes a number of recommendations that include a dramatic shift from coal over the longer term.
Ignacio Fernandez, welcome to SABC News. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
So, as South Africa struggles through a years-long and increasingly complex and debilitating energy crisis, California's energy crises over the last 2 decades, most recently in 2020, are often cited as an example in South Africa that this is not unique to South Africa. What do you make of the South African example, and what might we learn from how California, in this instance, or even perhaps the Chilean energy crisis in 2008, what can we learn from their approach to solving those crises there?
I think the situation in California, given the economic profile, the regulatory pattern, and the legislation in both jurisdictions are fairly different, right? So if you look at one and the other, you would say there's nothing similar in here, only the results, meaning energy crisis, right? So, but you can take that narrative in inverted, right? What's so different, and how can they come up to a similar results? And in that point, I'm going to correct myself because I believe the results are somewhat different. One, sitting at home and seeing what you call load shedding, we call coordinated blackouts, they're the same result. But the origins and the way you manage them are fairly different. So in California, and I'm going to go for a couple of examples. California and Chile are 2 very different examples, but we can draw lessons from that. So in California, the situation is that we're transitioning from a fairly clean grid to an even cleaner grid. For example, in California, there's no coal-fired power plants allowed, right, for many years. And now we're trying to transition from natural gas into completely renewable sources of energy. In this case of South Africa, is very, very different, right? We know that approximately 90% of the power generation comes from coal-fired power plants, right? Now, the most significant, rather than the sources of energy differences, is the electricity markets, how they run both in California and in South Africa. In California is absolutely mostly private, right? So we differentiate 3 types of power generations. One is independent-owned utilities, right? Completely private. The other ones are municipal or public-owned utilities, which are in the hands of municipalities, right? However, even though they're public, they are run as private companies, right? So that facilitates the work of the government on setting their policies by sending market signals, and that's what it is, right? There are obviously some sticks, not only carrots, in the sense of like the type of pollution and emissions and energy efficiency levels and all of that, but it's mostly associated with market mechanisms. In South Africa, given the power provider is, I would say like 90% also is in the hands of the state, that deprives the government from sending any market signals, because there's not much of a market there, right? So from that difference, it would impede for us to draw some potential solutions.
So privatization, is that what you're saying is probably one of the key factors that needs to happen moving forward? I mean, the unions in South Africa are not going to like that.
I'm not saying that privatization is the solution, right? Because in California, pretty much everything is private. In Chile, it's a lot more private than in the U.S. actually. And in both jurisdictions, in both countries, we have the same situation. So I'm not saying that privatizing the energy sector will solve that type of solution. What I'm saying is, if in the case of being private, in the case of like the energy sector being private, facilitates energy or market-based solutions for the government. So when South Africa is looking for examples outside, I would stay away from the ones that are purely market-oriented.
There's a report on how California in 2020, working with leading manufacturers and contractors, including General Electric, took 42 days to install 430-megawatt aeroderivative gas turbines to supplement the supply of energy that was lost due to plants going offline, scorching temperatures, runaway fires, and such. South Africans today are looking for a quick fix. They want to keep the lights on. What can they do in the short term?
When you are confronting a situation that you have this type of shortages, you can come up with patches, right? Like what California did was a patch. And in fact, a few days ago, I was in a hearing on how to get away from that patch. So the understanding it was, and the money that was spent in that solution, everyone had clear that was a temporary situation, right? So from what I remember from years ago, in South Africa has been having these load shedding situations from
since 2007,
2007, something like that. And every time a patch has been put in place. So it's sort of like the old story of like, you see in the river a baby floating, so you go and take it out, and then another one, and you don't spend enough time to look who's throwing those babies down upstream, right? So it's the same situation. If we keep patching up, what happens in the terms of like in energy we call the load consumption, the marginal load consumption, right? So in the next period, we're going to have an increase in the consumption. So we are trying to affect that increase by putting a patch. You're never going to solve the interim, the most important issue. Now, I did a quick analysis of the growth of the installed capacity in South Africa, and I found something last night that was kind of shocking. And I'm looking at a graph where I can see, and the data is from the International Energy Agency and the Department of Energy in the US, that the installed capacity proportionally in the last 5 years in South Africa has grown faster than the consumption. So one would ask, why is this happening, even though the increase in the capacity is increasing? So I think, and from all the articles that I read, very little, or I would dare to say none, has addressed the issue of energy efficiency and demand response.
Yeah, I've got a list here for you. It's, the reason they can't keep the lights on is because it's due to poor maintenance of power stations that exist. They constantly have to be shut down for repairs, the slow completion of additional coal-powered stations that have yet to be brought online, the infrastructure deficits, corruption at Eskom, the power utility, and the list goes on. Now, you talked a bit about how there are no coal-powered stations in California, and we're having this big conversation in the context of COP26 that's happening in Glasgow and this transition away from fossil fuels. It's a big conversation in South Africa. What advice would you give them in that regard?
I would say that, when the life gives you lemons, make lemonade. So this is a very good opportunity for South Africa to, have a strike to the helm and go in a completely different direction, right? So on the one hand, and the point that I want to emphasize on the terms of infrastructure, there's poor infrastructure for sure, but not just the generation, is the transmission and distribution. And I would like to pay closer attention to the amount of losses on that end. Also, the amount of loss opportunities on the consumption itself. So industry is the primary consumer of electricity in South Africa, but there's no rules for how you consume that electricity. There's no rules about what we call MEPS, minimum energy performance standards, right? So that's something that you can address immediately. And the other point you want to embark on the production, this is a golden opportunity for South Africa to address the international community, not necessarily by direct financing, but on loans. South Africa has a large amount of solar radiation. There's a big issue there's a big potential for South Africa to increase both solar and wind. And in the numbers I saw in South Africa are increasing, but they're still very marginal, very minimal. And I think there's a golden opportunity for South Africa to increase the renewable portfolio, and that can be done quickly.
Obviously, there are economic implications when you have a discussion like this. I wonder how that informed, the crisis in Chile in 2008 and more recently in California. How does that economic imperative influence some of the policy decision-making behind closed doors?
Yeah, from that, I would say the parallel is closer to what happened in Chile back in 2008. We had a very abrupt energy crisis because we had an agreement with Argentina to supply us with natural gas. And all of a sudden, because of the internal situation in Argentina, they had to cut that supply of natural gas to Chile from one day to the next, right? So we very quickly, within 2 or 3 months, the government in Chile had to come up with a solution both on the supply and also on the demand, right? So on the demand side, there was an incredible energy efficiency campaign at the residential level, which, by the way, that's a very good hint. Residential universally is usually 15% of the electricity consumption, right? Only 15%, but it's very flexible. You can cut down the residential electricity consumption very rapidly just by changing behavior, And there's the campaign was like to change the light bulbs or turn off the light bulbs, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, what we did at that point was like calculate what was going to be the economic impact to the society if we had to come out with brownouts or load shedding. And with that marginal cost, we said, okay, so we had to take that amount of money and put it into both consumption reduction, right? And also a quick elements of supply. So what we did, we installed in a matter of months, we made quick contracts with LNGs, with liquefied natural gas plants on the ports, meaning there's a very vast a market of liquefied natural gas boats going all over the place, and you can hook them up and very quickly supply. It's not cheap, but it was cheaper than losing the amount of electricity, losing the production that we would have lost if the electricity wasn't provided effectively.
You know, at the beginning of this conversation, you talked about how it's difficult to make comparisons because each situation is essentially unique. As you correctly point out, South Africa's electricity supply is dependent on, in large part, on coal-powered stations. Talk about what the future looks like here, right? I mean, we're moving away from fossil fuels. There's a great deal of talk about the right energy mix. What does the right energy mix perhaps look for, like for a country like South Africa?
Well, I would say, I mean, doing a quick analysis of the portfolio and the potential, South Africa, I mean, has a great potential on wind and solar energy for sure. Now, that's not 24/7 type of energy production, right? So you have to look into storage, and that gets a little bit more expensive. But the way I would think, very humbly, I would approach the situation in South Africa, which many countries have done around the world. We historically look at energy production on a base load provided by fossil fuels and using renewables to peak, basically to go on top of that base load. Why don't we flip it, right? So power as much as possible, as much as we can from solar and wind, which, by the way, once it's constructed, the operation maintenance is close to zero. So once it's been paid for, the electricity is extremely cheap. And on those valleys, or that production that is needed to peak, then you can power with coal-fired power plants or natural gas.
Pretty much what we saw in the UK recently, right? They had a deficit and they fired up the coal-powered stations. Final question for you. I want to end with this. How do you manage public expectations? You have a very irate, angry, frustrated public that is demanding answers, calling for people to resign. They want the lights on. I mean, this is affecting small businesses, large businesses like mining. What's your advice on how to manage public expectations, given your experiences in Chile?
Yes, unfortunately, the answer for that is final results, right? You cannot come up with a number of you mean, if you work very hard and you do all these contracts and in the end up that you have to do load shedding, excuses are not good reasons, right? So our approach in Chile was like, you have to keep the lights on no matter what, right? And the advantage that the government of South Africa, because it's a blessing, it's a curse, that they control all the power supply. So take that advantage. So if you go on a quick rampage to install solar capacity, to increase the solar capacity and wind capacity, but those results will not come up for the next 2-3 years. What can come up really quick is a quick demand response management. What we did, but because Chile is a natural resource productive country like South Africa.
Similar to South Africa, yeah.
Yeah, with the #1 producer of copper, we talked to the copper producers and said, what is the possibility of you, first of all, improving your energy efficiency of your production? And if you need to change your capital investment, we can give you a break on that, right? We can give you a break and facilitate your change of equipment very quickly, and also lowering your production at certain hours, because we're going to be managing that demand. That ended up being a very quick. It doesn't fluctuate the needle that much, but it was good enough in order not to come up with load shedding situations. So you have to have the long-term solution with quick short-term solutions at the same time. Always.
So I'll tell you what the quote of the interview is: excuses are not a good reason. Ignacio, thank you so very much indeed.
Thank you very much for having me.
Ignacio Fernandez is a climate and energy policy analyst with 20 years experience, mostly at the international level, and currently a senior advisor at Southern California Edison, the primary electricity supply company for much of Southern California. Thanks again.
Thank you.